Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks a lot for tuning into a new episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll read chapter 13 of My Effin Life by Geddy Lee. Without further ado, let's see how this chapter unfolds. In June 1976, a certain wedding was in the offing. Mine. Nancy and I had decided to tie the knot, despite the knowledge that as long as the band lasted, I'd routinely be away from her for weeks and months on end. She was not only willing to take me on, but prepared, she thought, to take on the life of a +1, as she so self-effacingly put it. As I've already mentioned, however, we kept our relationship pretty much hidden from my mom, and our engagement wouldn't be official until the two ladies met face to face. Even before that, Nancy had decided to convert to Judaism, taking Hebrew classes, adopting the Hebrew name Leah, and going so far as to take a dip in the mikveh. Now, I emphasize it was she who made the decision, because I would never have asked her to do it. It really didn't matter to me. But in her wisdom, she knew what an olive branch it would extend to my mother. Nancy was raised a United Church Protestant, but harbored no religious feelings of her own. Like me, if she was anything, she was an atheist. But having learned from me what Mom's family had endured in the Holocaust, she wanted her to know that she respected her faith and would do what she could to help her swallow the pill of another wine-rib marriage outside the Orthodox tradition. Because ultra-religious Jews do not consider conversion legitimate, Mom's new husband Max helped us find a Reform rabbi to preside. I accompanied Nancy to a couple of her lessons, and I have to tell you, I hated them. They brought back awful memories of my own Hebrew school education, but she won huge points with me for going through all that. The first family dinner, meanwhile, was awkward, but Nancy was a total doll, and my mother put aside her reflexive cynicism for the evening. Let me tell you, my mom could really dish if she felt like it, so that was a testament not just to her intestinal fortitude, but her natural intelligence too. To accept me dropping out and becoming, of all things, a musician, and now to accept that I was about to be married outside of the faith, Nancy's conversion notwithstanding, was unheard of in the world she had grown up in. But she understood that the world was changing, and difficult though it must have been for her, throughout her life, she'd continue to let old dogmas lie and adapt to new ways. Now, you may be wondering how Nancy's family accepted me. I remember the culture shock of the first time I was invited to dinner. I came from a Jewish household where the table groaned with great quantities of overcooked foods that tended towards beige or brown. All the hand-me-down delicacies that had made the journey from the chatillas of Europe with exotic names like cholent, kasha, potato neck, farfel, gribbings, subala, mit schmaltz, herring. Clearly we're big on schmaltz. Chopped liver, and of course the ubiquitous gefilte fish. As in many immigrant homes, you had to eat everything you were given, under threat of punishment, because apparently, somewhere in the world, Jews were always starving, as if me cleaning off my plate was helping them out. For condiments, there was the ever-present beet horseradish, or if you like, Jewish wasabi, which shot a rocket up your nostrils, and could liven up even the toughest leather brisket. Very few actual fresh vegetables were ever served. Greens were either beans from a can, or iceberg lettuce, which I'd like to point out is barely green. Finally, on holidays, Mom would make us a deep dish matzo meal pancake called boobala that you covered in sugar or applesauce and devoured before your cousins got their mitts on it. My dad's specialty had been breakfast, when he'd make his matzo brie and his famous beef salami verts and eggs, a tradition I carried on for my family and now my grandson, who prefers hot dogs to verts. But one must adapt, right? There was also everyone else's favorite, boiled carp. But that, ugh, I wouldn't even try. Mom also loved boiled chicken, especially the feet. Ugh, again. I remember coming home from school to find her cooking up a storm and her turning around at the stove with a nice plump claw sticking out of her mouth. I was like, "Mom, what are you eating?" "Oh," she said, plucking it from her lips, "feasts. They're delicious." So anyway, the first time I sat down for dinner at Nancy's parents' house, I felt like a visitor from another planet. Everything was nice, friendly, and polite, and nice. Nancy's mother, Louise, plated and apportioned each of us a thin slice of rare roast beef, a few carrots and green beans, with a tidy pat of mashed potatoes on the side. I wolfed it down, wanting more, but not daring to ask, and since none was offered, waited patiently until we could leave the table and grab a burger elsewhere. I got along well with Louise, but her father John was a little different. When he was young, he had suffered from hearing issues that left him with a speech impediment, so he was a man of few words to begin with, but even fewer with me at the table. Never rude, but aloof. Raised on a farm at the outskirts of Toronto, he harbored traditional white old-school Christian values, and perhaps a few old-school prejudices too, and frankly, didn't much care for his daughter, dating a long-haired, unemployed high school dropout with rock star ambitions. One time, I overheard Louise asking him, "What is it about him that you don't like? The fact that he's a musician, or that he's Jewish?" And just as he mumbled something in return, he noticed me at the bottom of the stairs, with my smiling Punnam looking up. "Oh, hi, Mr. and Mrs. Young," I said with a certain satisfaction, and that was the end of the exchange. Over time, he realized that I didn't really have horns, so far as he could see, and we grew to have a fairly good relationship, especially once we realized that we shared a love of baseball, which he had played passionately as a young man. So at the Hyatt Regency on June 20th, 1976, Nancy and I tied the knot. It was a small wedding, attended almost entirely by our friends, plus our parents and one couple from each of their families. Alex, Neil, and John Rutsey all at the same table. That was weird to see. Along with my crew guys and the best man, my longtime pal Oscar. Nancy and I wrote our own vows and walked down the aisle to Sati's Gymnopédie number 3. I didn't get high, but everyone around me did. I remember them sneaking outside to smoke up. I think it was a joyous event, though you wouldn't believe it from the tense look on my face in the wedding photos. Lighten up, dude. We honeymooned in the time-honored fashion at Disneyland. Honest. Then we flew to Maui, where after too many Mai Tais and pina coladas at Trader Vic's, my red-headed bride got sunburned beyond belief, spending the rest of the time in bed, alone, until her skin absorbed the aloe vera and the pain subsided. Then we headed home to say goodbye for what would be some of the busiest years of my life. Poor girl. I don't think she quite realized what she had signed up for. Frankly, nor did I. Although, of course, the person who leaves usually has the easier time of it. I had adventures ahead of me, which she was fine with for the most part, aside from the occasional weak moment when I disappeared up my own ass and didn't call for a couple of days. But then, she'd never know what version of me would be arriving home. So tired after too many gigs in a row, or full of myself after the band's recent success. I'd be used to someone cleaning my room and bringing me breakfast and all the amenities of hotel living. I was like the conquering hero coming home, and then it's your turn to take out the garbage. And while I found it exceedingly difficult to transition to home life, it was just as hard for her to accommodate me as she built her own career. A small indication of Rush's rising fortunes was that we could now afford another transport upgrade. Our crew inherited the fabled Funcraft as we rode in a cumbersome new Barth RV and hired a good old boy from Virginia to drive it for us. George, or George, as we nicknamed him, was at the wheel one day when we felt the ride getting increasingly bumpy. He looked in the rear view and coolly announced in his thick southern drawl, "Fellas, I think I see the problem." We looked out the window in time to witness one of our tires overtaking us on the highway before careening off the road. Though we did not appreciate it at the time, I would now say that was a metaphor for our very lives getting ahead of us. Around this time, we were averaging around 180 shows every 10 months. Our bottomless well of youthful energy was beginning to drain, and we found ourselves in need of a little something extra. People of the age of Aquarius, we weren't too shy about experimenting. Be they the usual suspects like weed or acid, magic mushrooms, STP, or pretty much anything other than speed or heroin. We definitely considered those last two uncool. So when the notorious white nose candy inveigled its way backstage, we checked it out too without hesitation. In 1977, Coke was fast becoming the rock and roll touring network's new allure. We were so numbed out by the endless driving and near nightly gigging that a quick energy burst seemed nothing if not practical. At first, I considered it to be almost medicinal, though I now know that was just your typical imbiber's rationalization. We all started out as occasional users, but from 77 into the early 80s, it increasingly became a common part of our impedimenta. This may sound suspicious, after all I've confessed to you, but I was in fact less experienced and more conservative than my partners when it came to this. They knew when they could handle it and when they couldn't, and they would never do anything that would interfere with the quality of their performance. But I had even given up smoking pot by then because it made me paranoid. You need both a body that can handle it and a will to control that body. And I was unprepared for just how much Coke would get its hooks in me. It was all too tailor-made for my situation. I started doing lines after shows with whomever else was hanging out backstage. That plus a couple drinks, equaling immediate rejuvenation and loads of blah blah blah. Everyone yammering away at 80 miles an hour, and each of us imagining we were at the center of a deep and interesting conversation. I assure you, we were not. What may have begun as a lively, inspired exchange soon became twitchy, repetitive, and dull, because the reality of being high on blow is that your brain starts to freeze while your mouth keeps motoring on. The moment you run out of words, you lay out another line to recapture the night's first rush. But that moment is actually long gone, and all you're left with is too much shenna running through your bloodstream, making you jittery and in need of another drink to settle down. It's an inane and vicious cycle. Bolivian marching powder being ubiquitous in those days, there were very few people in my life who did not either carry on them that little telltale vial with the black screw top or wear a tiny Coke spoon around their neck. I was given one on a necklace, disguised as a musical note pendant. One of my touring pals and I were constantly on the lookout for a bit of Shana, and pretty quickly, it wasn't enough to merely do one line after the show. He would meet me at the side of the stage during Neil's drum solo, or before the encore to do a snort, or two. Away we'd go, and I could finish the night with a little extra pizzazz. Now, you may be asking, why did you need to jazz yourself up? Didn't you have thousands of people in the audience doing that for you? That's true, but it was fun anyway. Fun and illicit to sneak back, do a line, and come charging out for the grand finale. But what began as, we insisted, just some harmless fun, proved to be reckless, not least because it did my voice no favors at all. The more coke I did, the more cigarettes I'd smoke, which led to a serious cough, and as an added bonus, trouble sleeping. The very thing I'd picked up as a cure for fatigue ended up aggravating the problem. And at one point, we had a driver who, after laying out lines behind an amp or on the monitor board, would announce, "Doctor's office is open." He was a really bad influence because, basically, the doctor's office was almost always open. At the back of my mind, I knew I was doing myself harm. Plus, I had nosebleeds and a crusty nose. But despite my better instincts, I kept at it. We started seeing dodgier people at gigs simply because they had some Shana for us. Looking back, that period was not just surreal and not just nuts, but dangerous. If only because, while that substance seemed cool to us, the range of buyers and sellers who came bearing it were decidedly not. It was after a gig in one Midwestern city that I climbed aboard our bus to find a man sitting at the table up front with his briefcase snapped open and his scale set up, measuring out grams for the crew as they popped by to pick up their purchases. I was freaked out. That briefcase not only carried an enormous rock of coke, but had a big-ass satellite phone built right into it too. Not normal. Almost no one had cell phones back then. I was thinking, who is this guy? He must be a serious player. We found out afterward that Sirius didn't even cover it. He was a big-time dealer. Definitely not the kind of dude we should be associating with, let alone doling out grams on our bus. What the were we thinking? The guy was so dangerous that the FBI was sniffing around our next gig, looking for him. Talk about a wake-up call. As the road trips got longer and the pace of life quickened, I was losing my hold on reality. Even home was no longer safe, so I found it impossible to return to the sense of normalcy I had previously relied upon after coming off the road. I remember coming back for a break, only to discover that Nancy and some of her fashion world friends were part of the party scene too. There was just no escaping it. We maintained that we had it under control, but into the early 80s, coke was a road staple for innumerable people with whom we traveled and worked, and it was waiting to greet us when we first recorded in the UK. For some, having a little Shana around during the Farewell to Kings sessions certainly helped keep our eyes open, wide open, as our schedule went later and later into the night. I hasten to say that we didn't do any coke while actually recording, but some of those not involved in the session at that moment certainly felt it was safe to do so. Finally, a couple of events began to put an end to my romance with Toot. One occurred on an off day in a small town in Texas while on tour. Bored and restless, my musician friend and I heard of some punters carousing at the hotel, so we went down and crashed the party, a highly uncharacteristic thing for me to do. Well, it didn't take long before we figured out that there was a girl holding some coke. We persuaded her to bring the party to our bus, but all we wanted was her nose candy, and once we had done all of it, we made our excuses and asked her to leave. He and I then nursed a quiet and somewhat guilty drink. When I got to my room for some unlikely sleep, I just felt awful. I was disgusted with myself, taking advantage of a fan just to get a little buzz from some coke. It was truly a terrible moment for me, and one that really did awaken me to the trap I had fallen into. Almost. Sometime after that, I was at a big after-show party in London. I had reduced my regular Shana intake by then, and decided that on this particular night I would stay straight, maybe just enjoy a drink or two. As I mingled amongst the guests standing around the room in intimate circles, I noticed that there was little talking going on, or little of interest at any rate, but a whole lot of staring and sniffling and licking of teeth, all nervous and herky-jerky. Everyone was waiting for someone else, anyone else, to invite them to the bathroom stalls for another bump. Then they'd return and repeat the whole damn ritual. That was the worst part of it. No one laughing or even trying to tell jokes. The opposite of a pot party where everyone is laughing, even if they don't know what they're laughing at. I mean, how do you make a strung-out person chuckle? The pointlessness of it all was suddenly as obvious to me as the schnoz on my own goofy face. I pretty much stopped then and there. Over the coming months, I might occasionally have a line and a smoke to see if I really missed it. But the fact was, I really didn't, and I've never looked back. Like LSD, I guess it was some kind of rite of passage, something I had to live through. I still had lots of pals who kept on doing it happily, which I figured was fine. I had no right to judge or try to talk them out of it. It was just over for me. I'm fortunate to have been able to simply walk away from stuff like that. Because I'd been such a quiet boy, I enjoyed the travel and the socializing, the luxuries and the extras that came with being in a band. I felt I had some catching up to do. But even when I dove in, there was always a voice inside me that told me when enough was enough. A part of my brain would kick in and tell me, "Dude, this is a losing road you're on here. This is not you. This is not who you want to be." That voice has served me well throughout my life. In those days, of course, everyone knew somebody who'd OD'd, who had served as a cautionary note, if you were smart. But losing my dad at such a young age had really set my clock ticking. For a long time, I never truly believed I'd live longer than he had. It was an irrational thought, but the fear of it drove me in two directions at once. On the one hand, it made me want to live my life to the fullest, which included hedonistic pursuits such as this. But on the other, it probably saved me because no matter how up I was, I always had the good sense to just knock it on the head and get back to my room. While we're on the topic, I quit cigarettes the same way. By 1983, in the studio producing The Boys Brigade, I was smoking up to a pack a day. I developed a hacking cough and felt lousy all the time. But it only slowly dawned on me that the smokes weren't helping any. Then, with a deadline looming, I looked down at my ashtray, and it suddenly struck me that the worst thing in the world would be to smoke another. I threw the pack away and never took a drag again. Well, that's the end of chapter 13. Let me know what you thought of this chapter in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.